Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out in person. We have some folks on Zoom as well, and we're delighted that you're here. I'm Harold Holzer, Director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of President Jennifer Raab, we want to welcome you here. This is not only our first LGBTQ Policy Center event of the semester, more consequentially, it's the first under the center's new director, Erin Mayo Adam. So we want to welcome her. It's wonderful to have her at Roosevelt House, and I should start by saying a few words about her. She will serve as the moderator of tonight's discussion. She's also an assistant professor in Hunter's Political Science Department and a member of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Faculty and Curriculum Committee, also a member of the Public Policy Faculty. She's got us covered several ways here. She's the author of Queer Alliances, How Power Shapes Political Movement Formation, and has also published in numerous academic journals. Her research is situated in the fields of American politics, law, and society, especially social movements, interest groups, policy, gender and sexuality, and migration and labor politics. We're also proud to welcome back Professor Daniel Hurwitz of Hunter's History Department, whose teaching and research focuses on 20th century American history, the development of gendered and sexual identities, and the emergence of the movement for LGBTQI+ rights, as well as the resistance generated by it. And that's going to be an interesting topic tonight since we're following the Virginia gubernatorial election by less than a couple of weeks. And these subjects were brought up clearly in that strange election. He's the author of Stepping Out, which presents the history of LGBTQI+ life in Manhattan as a series of walking tours. There's more about our participants tonight in the program, so I'm being very brief. And finally, it's a special pleasure for me to welcome my friend, State Senator Brad Hoylman, who has authored and sponsored major legislation for the LGBTQI+ community, including the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, protecting transgender and non-binary New Yorkers, and a ban on the practice of sexual orientation change efforts, or so-called conversion therapy. Brad has been the prime sponsor of legislation calling for increased LGBTQI+ awareness in New York State's curriculum, which is the subject of tonight's discussion. So welcome to all of you for the first of what we hope will be many LGBTQ Policy Center discussions hosted by and organized by Erin Mayo Adam, who I now invite with her panelists to take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you both for being here. This is the first time I've been in person, I think, in 2 years. So I'm a bit excited to be able to moderate an in-person event. So I thought what we would do is I'd start with just some general questions about your own work on this issue, and then I'll move into some targeted questions on policy in New York State. And in the last about 10, 15 minutes, we'll do Q&A from the audience, if that sounds good to everyone. All right, so I'll go ahead and just start. So can you tell us a little bit about your work on inclusive education policy in New York State? I guess we can start with either one. Who wants to begin?
I'm happy either way. I can jump in. I think my policy work is much less significant than the senators, but I can just tell you a little bit of my personal experience with this topic. My training as in my PhD program and as a professor, as Harold mentioned, is in LGBTQ history, and I would say I was teaching at Hunter for a handful of years, back in maybe it's 2010 or 2011, when Tyler Clementi, the Rutgers student who'd been bullied by a roommate, committed suicide off the George Washington Bridge. And I remember in that moment, and in the wake of that, thinking about how could I be here, being an academic and this being my field, and somehow not having an impact on a life like that, or how could I have an impact? And you'll probably remember there was that whole wake of It Gets Better videos that emerged at that time. But one thing that really spoke to me was a friend of mine worked at GLSEN at the time. And she said that GLSEN's research demonstrated that one of the strongest ways to create change for young LGBTQ folks was to have a teacher in a school speaking in a positive or normalizing way about an LGBTQ person or event. That just one teacher in a classroom could change a school culture. And it was as if like a switch, a light bulb went on for me, because I realized like I'm sitting here at Hunter where we're training future teachers. Here is an opportunity for me to start making that change happen. And so over the last 10 years, I've sort of been working in different ways at trying to train New York City teachers or future teachers in this work, whether it's master's students at Hunter or teachers already out in schools around the city. And most recently, the project that I was involved in is a project of the Department of Education here in the city to develop curriculum, a book of curriculum for K through 12 teachers that contains 20 little biographies and primary documents that really make it easy for them to start to fold LGBTQ lives into the history and the social studies programs that they're already doing. That's a project called Hidden Voices, and the Museum of the City's been involved, and New York Historical Society. WNET has been making little videos to go along with it. So that's sort of been the most recent and probably the most significant expression of this desire of mine to kind of make a change around LGBTQ inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Good to see you, Aaron and Daniel and Harold, and good to see all the students here and on Zoom, and happy Veterans Day. My work, similarly, I think, is informed by Daniel's experience. When you pass a bill in Albany, it often derives out of something deeply personal. For me, it was being a gay man in the Senate, the only one in the Senate for most of the last 8+ years that I've served. We now have two, Jabari Brisport, who's a great addition to our two-person caucus in the Senate. But it also is informed by the fact that we've seen such a hatred and ignorance and lack of understanding in our society and culture, certainly spurred on by social media and terrible crimes committed against certainly LGBTQI+ folks, but also toward a lot of other people. And the social upheaval over the last couple of years around violence against AAPI folks or people of color, I think really necessitates an urgency that we need to fundamentally look at how and what we're teaching our kids in schools, because this is our moment to instill in them civic values of respect and cooperation and mutual understanding that I think is lacking. It's certainly lacking in parts of New York. And by way of, civics education, I think we failed. And the New York State curriculum on civics education seems very thin at best. So I've partnered with Assemblywoman Rebecca Seawright on legislation to require an LGBTQI history curriculum, as well as a number of other bills that I'm happy to talk about. But the societal effect of us not acting is what we've learned from groups like GLSEN and the Trevor Project, where young queer people, particularly gender nonconforming or transgender, are something like 3 times more likely to attempt or think of attempting suicide. And boy, we've got a lot of work ahead of us if we're going to make young queer people feel comfortable in the classroom and as young adults as they enter into society.
Yeah, thank you both. And I just wanted to pick up, since you brought up backlash, there seems to be a lot of misinformation about what inclusive curriculum is. And then you also mentioned GLSEN. So I wanted to say this statistic and then ask a follow-up question. So currently, according to a 2019 survey that GLSEN did, only 28% of LGBTQ students in New York were taught positive representations of LGBTQ people, history, or events in their K through 12 education. So thinking about that and misinformation, what does a inclusive curriculum look like? What is it that we're talking about when we are talking about passing legislation or adopting curriculum that would address that statistic?
I mean, it's a shocking statistic to realize in New York City. And I have to say, I'm extremely proud of the fact that the New York City Department of Education, under the direction of the City Council, has taken the lead in addressing this issue and creating this curriculum. This Hidden Voices curriculum just rolled out last year in the middle of the pandemic, and we've all been kind of on a campaign to bring it to teachers and start to work with teachers to show them how they can start to use it. My sense, and the sense of the team of folks who worked on this curriculum, is that an inclusive curriculum is not some outrageously difficult thing to achieve. To talk about LGBTQ curriculum is not to put on very full plates that teachers already have a whole new pile of material with the expectation that they cover it. It's rather shifting the prism slightly around people or events that are already inside of the curriculum. So if you think of some of the great staples of American history, whether it's Walt Whitman or Jane Addams or even Eleanor Roosevelt's world and the influence that her female friends had on American politics, we're already talking about those people in our K through 12 social studies curriculum. What we're not just even mentioning, and I think what the GLSEN research shows is even just a mention would really shift the culture. We're not mentioning that Jane Addams founded Hull House with her life partner. We're not mentioning that Walt Whitman's love of comrades and this celebration of kind of the American spirit was part of the way that he, the relationships, he came out of the relationships he had with men and how that was part of what he saw was possible. Just to say, Jane Addams had a life partner named Ellen Starr and mention that when you talk about Hull House, you don't have to dig into her intimate life. You don't have to go past that. But that already is an enormous change for our curriculum and has an enormous impact for our students. In my US history class today, we were talking about the Black Civil Rights Movement. To put up on the screen and talk about Martin Luther King speaking at the March on Washington, it's not that hard to also mention that Bayard Rustin, his kind of secret gay lieutenant, organized the March on Washington. It doesn't pull you away from the curriculum you're already doing. In fact, it makes the world that you're describing at that event feel more like the world that our students are living in. So I think the thing that I'm emphasizing, maybe overemphasizing, is that we're not asking teachers to do something unmanageable. I think an inclusive curriculum that highlights LGBTQ Americans or world figures who are already there in the curriculum, but just mentions this part of their lives, even in passing, would be an enormous shift.
Yeah, so our legislation specifically would direct the State Department of Education to develop LGBTQ history, a curriculum, so that our students can learn. I think probably one of the worst ideas would be for politicians like me to draft the curricula when it should be in the hands of historians and experts and people who know. So that's why we ask them to do it. But yeah, history is so complicated. I think about my own neighborhood. I represent Greenwich Village, where Stonewall is, of course. And a couple of blocks from me is a building, 1 Fifth Avenue. And at one point in time, there were so many illustrious figures in the LGBTQ civil rights movement who lived in that building, for better or for worse, active in an impact on LGBTQ history, such as former Mayor Ed Koch, former Congresswoman Bella Abzug, Edie Windsor from that famous decision, and Larry Kramer, who founded ACT UP. I often think, can you imagine getting in the elevator with all four of those figures at the same time? It might have been uncomfortable, I'm not sure. But it goes to the point that I think Daniel kind of alluded to, which is history is so rich and multifaceted, and it's all around us, and queer history is part of that. So at the end of the day, though, I think it's really up to the historians to consult with the Department of Education so we get it right as policymakers.
It's great. I'm really glad to hear you say it, Brett, because I think one of the things that we've seen, right, there are a handful of states now that have passed this kind of legislation. California maybe took the lead, New Jersey quite recently. But what they haven't included in that legislation was a mandate, let alone funding, to develop the curriculum. So, for instance, I've been contacted by school districts in New Jersey that are sort of like, okay, the law is on the books, now what do we do? As opposed to saying, all right, let's get the Department of Education or the Board of Regents, and let's get the folks who are leading education, like to have that in the legislation, let's get those folks involved in writing this curriculum. The other thing I was struck by just when you're describing 1 Fifth Avenue is...
I'm sorry, it's actually 2 Fifth Avenue, across the street, sorry.
Okay, 2 Fifth Avenue. Somehow in my head I can still see the building, whatever its address is it just reminds me how much this curriculum can reflect the world that our young people are living in. They are living in a world in which these folks, in which LGBTQ lives are all around them, whether they're queer or not. This is the world that our young people are growing up in. And so I think including this material in our social studies and history curriculum not only makes the world or the classroom feel safer for LGBTQ students, it also helps to explain the world that all of the students are in. Like, I think what social studies teachers are really good at is working on citizenship and or cultivating students to understand the world that they're in. That is their primary goal. And I think if we're not talking about LGBTQ issues, if we're not helping them to think about a fight, let's say about marriage equality, right, Edie Windsor's fight, then we're leaving a gap. We're not helping them to understand the world that they're in. If we put this material into the curriculum, we're assisting them in being better citizens, because these issues, like it or not, are in political battle right now. And so we need to, if we want to be good educators, give them the analytical tools, the language, the framework for thinking about what's at stake in these issues.
So on that note, let's talk a little about, you mentioned we're in this political battle right now, right? So currently, I think it's only 6 or 7 states require LGBTQ inclusive curriculum.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest barriers to adopting the curriculum, and how might we overcome those?
Well, I think from the political vantage point, money is definitely part of it. You know, it's about resource allocation and the fact that there are so many competing interests, particularly in public education, which is a big part of the state budget, but is funded outside of New York City by local property taxes. So you've got people who don't want to pay more for their 3-bedroom in suburbia because you know, their property taxes are really high, but that's exactly what is being used to fund their children's education. So that's a competing interest. And so when we talk about an LGBTQ curriculum for New York State, I hear my colleagues say, well, that's an unfunded mandate. In other words, Senator Hoylman and Assemblymember Seawright, that's great that you want to pass this. How are you going to pay for it? And if you don't pay for it, then you're going to just put it on the local school boards to raise the revenue from the local assessors' property taxes. So that's challenging because nobody wants to pay more in taxes, even for education, sadly, is the refrain that I hear often in Albany. Secondly, of course, there are ideological conflicts around specific curriculum, particularly for queer people and for other minorities, no doubt. And then third, there are competing curriculums. And they all have to be considered. I have a colleague, Senator John Liu, the only Asian American senator, and he has a bill to require the New York State Department of Education to institute an AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander curriculum. How does that fold into an LGBTQ curriculum? So there's competition among different groups to get a piece of the pie, which is understandable and frankly necessary.
I'm so sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, I think I know what we're both jumping in on. So it's interesting that you framed it as a competition, right, for resources. So my own research is on intersectional coalitions, intersectional policy coalitions, and oftentimes some of the biggest LGBTQ policies that we've seen passed nationwide have involved large cross-community coalitions with communities of color, with the AAPI community. One of the marriage equality coalition that I looked at in Washington State, the AAPI community was a massive supporter of that coalition. So what I sort of wonder is, why is there this, by contrast with education, we tend to talk about it in terms of little boxes, or we're checking off little identity boxes. So why is it that we are seeing this as competing identities rather than an intersectional cross-community coalition of collective interests?
Well, because I think one is the reality of the way politics works. It's certainly not my viewpoint, but I'll tell you that it's the way many interest groups operate at the grassroots level and in the halls of our state capitol. They fight for resources, they fight for legislation, and they view, unfortunately, and I would agree, they view this as a zero-sum game. So there's no question, though, if I pass this bill, then there would be other interest groups wanting to pass something similar for a different reason. And so it does beg the question, why not have a more collective legislative strategy that incorporates a range of histories of American people who have been ignored? And I think that's probably what we should be doing, and we should probably also make certain that whatever legislation that is brought forward has the appropriate funding attached to it. And that's, again, a challenge around resource allocation.
That idea of kind of creating a coalition of support really resonates for me. I remember talking to a AP US history teacher out in California when I was just sort of taking baby steps and thinking about this work, and I was asking this teacher, how did he incorporate this material into his class, his AP US class? And I remember him talking about that when he had students work on the 1960s and the movements of the 1960s, rather than just him talking, he invited the students to kind of take a piece of the story themselves and be responsible, was one piece. But the second piece was that he laid out, and they kind of then had maybe a big chart up on the board, maybe 4 or 5 different groups. And so some students were working on second wave feminism, and some students were working on Black civil rights, and some students were working on Latino activism, and some were working on LGBTQ activism. And so in the classroom, he was sort of modeling as the students were learning, and then they put it up on the board. Look how all of these different groups in America are engaged in kind of similar battles. And maybe they have differing strategies, they have different success rates, but this is part of kind of this moment in American history. In a way, it speaks to what could be motivating about a coalition of support for an educational program that followed that same kind of model, which is to say, yes, let's say what we need in our New York State curriculum is this kind of range of diverse stories. And it's not that we just need LGBTQ history, it's that we need LGBTQ and Latino and Asian American and African American, and maybe that's should be our legislative goal, because that would then invite a coalition of support into it. And it's how the teachers would use it as well.
And we've actually passed bills around certain educational requirements for different marginalized groups, which I think has been beneficial. But again, I think, I will admit, part of the danger here is letting politicians dictate to educators what they should be teaching. I really believe it should be coming from the ground up or from educators in coalition, not politicians who are, frankly, probably responding to outside pressure, interest groups, or self-interest, and promoting legislation. And we've seen that in the race for governor in Virginia. We've seen the critical race theory, hoopla across this country. And we've seen it, though, for decades. For the queer community, it goes back to Heather Has Two Mommies, and what Danny Drum, the current council member, endured as a teacher who was openly gay in his public school, and the questions that he had to face whether he was fit to even be in a classroom.
Yeah, so I'll just pick up on that point that you brought up, backlash, recent resurgence that we've seen against inclusive education. So I do you think this poses a problem for passing inclusive education in New York State? Or is there a way that we could respond that might serve as a model for how you would respond to those who seek not to include LGBTQ inclusive education in the curriculum?
I think it's an opportunity, but right now it's a challenge. I think those of us who are looking for inclusive education need to take a step back and think about what we're seeing across the country now that the inclusive curriculum has become a political wedge issue. But parents are angry. They're angered by mask mandates. They're angered by their children not being to meet in person. They're angered by the fact that they feel like they've missed an entire year. So there's a lot swirling in parent communities. I speak to them all the time as an elected official. And I don't know if we need a cooling off period, but I would really want to make certain that we don't push these issues forward and allow Republicans to mischaracterize. I say Republicans, and it's not really fair. Conservative forces to mischaracterize them as something that they're not. I think everyone I've spoken to, in terms of curriculum inclusion, have the best intentions. I just want to make certain that we don't hand opponents a win, as they had last Tuesday.
I do think we shouldn't be surprised that education is a political issue in America, though. I think we've seen that over and over again. I was just thinking about Lynn Cheney, and I can't even remember, maybe it's the early 90s or the late 80s, politicizing the American history standards at the time. So the fact that politicians are saying there's a battle here about our children shouldn't, I think, turn us off from doing the work that's in front of us. That's understandable. People are invested in the stories we tell about our country. It speaks to their relationship to the country, and if we want to expand the story, then of course people have a reaction. At the same time, I really hear what Brad is saying about kind of turning down the heat, and as I was thinking about it, I was trying to think, could I empathize with a parent saying, I don't want my kid taught this kind of a curriculum. And a parent, and what I was trying to imagine is maybe what a parent is saying, I don't want my kid to be taught something that makes them judge me or makes them love our community and the place we live any less. And there's a way that I could understand that as a parent, that I could understand that, right, you don't want to feel like school is threatening your relationship to your kids. And so, but what I think when I think about an inclusive education curriculum, like the way that we've described it, whether it's about talking about Walt Whitman or Jane Addams or Bayard Rustin, I think we can be clearer with our message that says, that's not what we're up to. The education we're talking about is not an education that would drive a wedge between your kids and you and your community. This is an education in some ways that's about celebrating the history of the country in its richness. And we want to invite as many people into that story as we can, but an inclusive curriculum is not a divisive curriculum by design. So I think there's a way in that conversation to keep turning down the heat and saying, that's not what we're up to. This is what we're trying to do. In a way that, I think that in a way we can continue to build bridges that way. I don't think we should give up on the project, though. I think the project is too important.
I mean, look, in my opinion, there's no more important role of government than public education. So I completely agree. My point is that let's have government consult and outsource it, if you will, to the experts, and not bring necessarily this issue to the floor of any chamber for a vote. Because in some ways, I'm afraid of what that might look like in some state houses across America. This is a time, frankly, for executive leadership. I would argue, whether it's governors or the president and the U.S. Department of Education, where we can build a national and state-by-state coalition.
I'm curious because, like, this little project that I worked on was funded by New York City Council, right? In the floor of that chamber, there was support to put money into this project. What do you think how do you think it would sound or play out on the floor in Albany? If rather than everywhere in the country, what about just here in our state?
Yeah, I think that's exactly my point. Because of, I'd like to think we'd have the same result, but we now have, in effect, a ban on introducing curriculum bills for votes. Now, I carry one with Assemblymember Seawright. But that doesn't mean it's getting a vote anytime soon. And again, it goes back to the challenge of resources and local property taxes and so-called unfunded mandates. So the reality is those bills may not get a vote. If we made it to the floor, we'd have the same vote. But I don't know if they'll make it to the floor. So we've got a lot more work to do in Albany. It's not as straightforward. For the better part of the last 100 years, the Republican Party controlled the New York State Senate. So that shows you that the state has a lot of contrasts in different parts. So I wish we had the clear, one-party majority that the New York City Council has, but it's not the case in Albany.
I'm really curious, and maybe this is too much in the weeds. I'm curious about the funding question. Because teachers around the state, there's funding for teachers around the state regularly to have professional development. That is in the budget already. They're constantly being trained in new techniques and new topics. That's not a new expense. So if 6 sessions in a school year were devoted to LGBT content instead of whatever else those 6 sessions were going to be, it wouldn't be an increase in the budget of those local school districts. New York City has already developed curriculum that New York State could adopt. I'm just trying to think about ways that we could argue there aren't huge funding costs associated with this legislation. Does that help us out any?
It does, for sure. And we make that case all the time, um, not just about curriculum issues, but about other kind of actions that the legislature wants to take that New York City already has done and has a roadmap for the rest of the state. But we still get pushback from local governments who are suspicious of our intentions and will push back because of the tax question. But yeah, for sure, the fact that New York has done so much of the work, it should be part of our case with this legislation.
We are getting to the point where we should move to audience Q&A, but before we do that, I wanted to, we mentioned a lot about opposition, so I wanted to ask one more question. We've talked a lot about why this curriculum is important for LGBTQ students. Why would this be important for non-LGBTQ students? What would you tell to people who are opposed to inclusive curriculum to, I guess, try to convince them that this is something that is necessary?
Well, I would say, to my colleagues in the Senate, we've seen the rise in hate crimes. Transgender people are among the most targeted of any minority for these types of heinous acts. And this is we need to respond to combat that at the earliest ages of education possible. So I really think there's probably, and this is kind of the way, again, my colleagues like to think, there's potential savings, and not just heartache and pain, but literally cost savings to our government. And that's, part of our pitch here, too. We reduce conflict as a result of increasing educational understanding.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Brad says. I think that I imagine that politicians on every side of every aisle would identify with cultivating an American culture of tolerance. That they're not. I don't think that most politicians would say I'm opposed to tolerance. And for LGBTQ kids and non-LGBTQ kids, including this material into their classes and their curriculum creates a culture of tolerance that will reverberate widely. And I imagine that a lot of politicians would stand up for that. And I think, just to echo what I said earlier, I think for non-LGBTQI folks, they are nonetheless living in a world that is full. Their media streams, their television shows are full of LGBTQI people. And we do them a disservice. We do those non-LGBTQI kids a disservice by not giving them the tools and the skills to understand what's happening in the world around them. We're leaving them ignorant and to really be engaged in the culture and the politics that's around them. And, you could end up being a strong opponent of marriage equality at the end of high school, having had this curriculum, and maybe that's fine, but at the very least, you'd know how to engage in the debate, you'd understand what the issues are, and so wherever you land on that debate, you'll have better equipped citizens if you give them this education to get them there.
Well, thank you both for your thoughts. I guess what I'd like to do now is turn it to the audience. I think we have a microphone going around.
Thank you. I don't know if this is, yeah, it is live. A quick statement and a semicolon and a question. I would love to see this linkage that is implied between K through 12 and higher ed. And the question is there academic psychological research that can provide a correlation between modeling of out educators and curriculum, that there might be a lessening of LGBTQ suicide, for example? I'm looking what ammunition can be offered to make a political case. And I think everything these days, we need to game out 6 layers deep. Not to be a Cassandra, but that every action has a particular reaction these days. Thanks.
And can you just say what was the first part before the semicolon?
Linkage that is more overt between K through 12 and higher ed, and working together and having a curriculum which is going back and forth, and if anything is more elaborate and sophisticated, but acknowledging the presence of each other's, particularly with CUNY and public schools.
I actually am going to jump in on that. Before I turn to the panelists, I'm in the process of co-editing the first volume on teaching LGBTQ politics for higher education. And some of our contributing authors make explicit connections between K through 12 and higher education. So for example, one of the contributing authors is a national expert on drives to ban books in education, which in the past have focused predominantly on LGBTQ books, but now we're seeing a greater shift to banning books that concern racial and ethnic politics, for example. And one of the things that we were really struck by is that there's almost no conversation about this in higher education. There's no crossover. There's a lot of materials for K through 12, like if you look on, I did an Amazon search, but there's almost nothing in higher education, which we thought was fascinating because students are demanding inclusive curriculum even more and more in higher education. So there is as someone who's co-editing a volume, there's a burgeoning community that's trying to do this, but it's very early stages.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I definitely think I've seen, like I was just thinking, oh, there's a queer history conference in June in San Francisco that I'm going to, and I know there'll be a lot of higher ed academics there, and there's gonna be a cohort of panels, et cetera, about K through 12 education. So there is a lot of bridging happening, but the movement is largely higher ed folks talking with K through 12 folks about how to develop the curriculum, as opposed to thinking about, well, couldn't higher ed be doing more of it? Here at Hunter, I definitely would agree with that. But to the other piece of your question, I wish that we were going to have a fellow panelist who was from GLSEN, and I turned to GLSEN for some of the best research and around this question of the impact of out educators and this kind of inclusive curriculum. It's very clear the impact on suicidality, on depression, on school climate. You know, I think we're familiar with the pejorative language of high schools, kind of that's so gay, right? And worse versions of that. And what GLSEN's research shows is even a single out teacher in a school, in a high school, has a dramatic effect on that school culture. So the research is there, and I do think it's very powerful. It was compelling for me. When I talk with teachers, I always share that research because I think it is compelling for them as well.
I would just add that you know, I liked your point, Daniel, about the need to have an educated citizenry, and because we live in this deliberative democracy where if we don't raise our kids to be well educated as citizens, how can they be expected to make the right decisions at the voting booth? So I mean, this all ties into, I think, a lot of what we need to do, particularly in light of misinformation and the you know, horrible impact, caustic effect of some social media on truth-telling and our elections.
Hi, I'm going to ask a couple questions on behalf of those joining us on Zoom. One is, what lessons have educators and policy advocates learned from other states that have made strides toward developing a good model of inclusive curriculum? And the second question, is the resistance to a more inclusive curriculum coming from parents or educators or both? Thanks.
Well, I would say I think that one thing that we've learned from other states is the importance of state leadership and really having a mandate. I think that teachers want to feel confident that their administration has their back should there be some kind of resistance in their communities. And so what we've seen is that when teachers are able to say, hey, this is the state standard, I'm following what's being asked of all high school teachers in New Jersey now, that gives them and their colleagues and the other teachers in the high school or in the middle school confidence that they're not putting themselves in jeopardy and their position in jeopardy by doing this work. That's one. I think the other thing that we've seen in California is California passed this law, maybe it was 2011, and then there were several years of developing curriculum to meet the mandate, with a bunch of historians around the country kind of getting involved in this. And so in some ways, I think we're in a great position in New York to be able to learn from those examples, because in a lot of ways, as I was suggesting to Brad, the curriculum now exists. So it would be great to have a mandate linked to curriculum that already exists so that this kind of legislation can go into effect quickly. In California, it took several years before teachers were really able to do the work, even though the legislature had authorized it.
And when we say teachers, you know, you have to think of teachers collectively too, and certainly allyship with the teachers union is crucial. And frankly, we've got more work to do on this bill in conjunction with that, because again, back to resource allocation and adding additional requirements on teachers is not, you know, always met with open arms in different parts of New York State.
Right, and I think that's often what I hear from teachers. They already, especially history teachers, I think especially U.S. history teachers feel like, I have to start, you know, from 1620 and get to whatever, 2020, and I've got 9 months, and I'm already overwhelmed. And that's why I think a curriculum that gently shows all the ways that this isn't new material, it's material you're already working with, is a way to address that feeling of being overwhelmed.
And teachers are already feeling overwhelmed. I mean, certainly these days, they're physicians in the classroom, they're nurses, they're mental health, they're asked to be mental health experts and social workers, and they don't have the support of professionals in those areas for which they should.
But I do think a lot of teachers, when I talk to teachers, they want to be making the space for their students to feel comfortable and safe. They want to be doing this work. So I rarely find that teachers say to us, oh, don't bother me with that. They might say, like, I don't know how I can do this, but they want to do it. And that's very moving to me. I'm inspired by their desire to do it. The other thing I just go back to that we've seen in other states is we have seen opposition emerge in California, for instance, after this legislation went into effect. We've seen groups like Focus on the Family kind of organize people to try to stop this legislation from really being put into effect. And that's why I think what we were talking about earlier about bringing more groups into the coalition of support rather than only LGBTQ families or only LGBTQ policy folks, but to create a coalition of supporters for maybe this kind of multifaceted diversity education would be a great protection against the opposition that might come.
Thanks for doing this. Before I ask my question, I just want to, I'm glad, Senator, that you corrected to 2 Fifth Avenue. And I will just say that the historian in me wants to tell you that there were 2 separate elevator banks. Bella was on the south side. Ed Koch and Larry Kramer were on the north side. And the mailboxes were separate. But it got to the point where the mayor got the co-op board to issue the equivalent of a co-op temporary restraining order on Larry Kramer. He was not permitted to speak to the mayor and complain about his slowness on combating AIDS in the mailroom. So Larry Kramer began taking his dog to the mailroom and saying, "Do you see that man? He's killing our people." This is a true story. And that was life in 2 Fifth Avenue. My question is, directed at those of you who have children. Tell us a little bit about when you went to school. And I know you went to school in various places. Brad is from West Virginia, believe it or not. Was anything taught? And Daniel, you made the point it's so easy to talk about Whitman or Jane Addams or Eleanor or Stonewall if you're talking about places in New York City. Was anything taught? And what are your children learning in school and in daycare, if anything? Or what are you hearing that they're learning?
I'll say that, yes, you're right. It is hard to believe I was raised in West Virginia. But I do remember with great fondness one course that we had, West Virginia history. And it was pretty, I think we'd probably consider it, the historians would consider it probably pretty routine history. But it was it was required of every 8th grader. And it was an entire year. And we learned a lot about the state that I still remember. And at the end of the course, they had a statewide competition around the history of the state, and they chose the best students in each school to visit the state capitol. I felt it was a civic building exercise that I have not yet seen my 2 daughters participate in. Now, granted, they're only 10 and 4, so perhaps there's something in the curriculum similar in New York, but I'm not familiar with it. But I'll also say that they have kind of a built-in understanding of LGBTQ history because of our family, but they get the questions all the time, and you know, if that were addressed earlier around you know, difference in families, you know, which has been for one of them, but it would certainly make life a little, you know, more straightforward at so to speak at home around that issue. But they're not really, I think, old enough to have participated in a more kind of nuanced discussion of LGBTQ history. What is the right age? What is the right age for these types of history kind of lessons, if you will?
I know I can go next. I have a 2.5-year-old who's in daycare now. I am from Cleveland, Ohio, but I really grew up in Simi Valley, California, which is the home of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. There was no curriculum, nothing. In fact, we didn't understand how to interpret the world around us, which was becoming more and more politicized around LGBTQ issues. And when I was in junior high school, there were several big political fights in the state, all that came to my hometown around marriage equality. So literally the only thing I knew about gay people was that they wanted to get married. And I remember one of my friends was so angry about it, she brought a pro same-sex marriage banner to school, was suspended, and her parents ended up pulling her out of school. So that was my lesson, was you don't even bring this up or else you're removed from public school. So it was a pretty, and I guess that sort of lit a fire under me, and I became very committed to trying to alter that sort of environment. And I will say that things do seem a bit different now, even from daycare. There's greater discussion of a broad array of diverse identities that we never addressed when I was in school. I live in Bay Ridge, and we have a very big Muslim community, and so my daughter's already been introduced to Eid, which I think is just wonderful. Our family is treated as a very normal family in the daycare, which is it's almost like a night and day difference from my own upbringing. But I can't really comment on broader curriculum yet because daycare doesn't really have a curriculum other than Play-Doh.
Well, I would just say I grew up in Southern California also, where I think there was no LGBTQ content in anything that I was taught. When I think about my kids now, I have a 15-year-old who's in 10th grade and starting American history, and I'm hanging on. I'm waiting to see what is introduced into that class. What I've heard from teachers is mostly LGBTQ content doesn't show up until Stonewall gets talked about. So there's no LGBTQ past. There are no LGBTQ lives prior to suddenly a rights movement emerging 1969. But what's interesting, we also have an 8-year-old, and what I've seen in his experience, and also in talking with 4th grade teachers at a Brooklyn elementary school, is those kids are already talking about gender diversity. My 8-year-old, knows kids who have transitioned or are using new pronouns, or he has a friend of a friend who's a they person like that he talks about. And the 4th grade, there's a 4th grade teacher I
That is
remember.
amazing, and I've experienced that too. And
Right, so which is to say they are in
but
this
I don't
world.
think it's coming from the school classroom.
No, but it says, like what the 4th grade teacher said when he brought this, I'm trying to remember, or he was gonna read a book, I think about a transgender kid with his class, and they were like, oh yeah, I've read it. Like they're ready to go to the next step. So to your question of what is the right age, I mean, elementary school, I think they are ready for it. Maybe they're not ready for a history of oppression, and whatever. We teach a variety of histories in modified ways with elementary school students, right? But they're ready for some foundational learning in these topics for sure.
I have a question for the senator. Did I understand you to say there is currently a ban of voting on anything related to education in Albany?
Ban is not the right word if I used it. It really is there is a hold, I think is the right term, on curriculum bills being voted on the floor until we figure out how the state Department of Education is going to work with the legislature on numerous requests to add additional curriculum into the discussion. As I mentioned, AAPI and LGBTQI are just 2 of the bills, but there are many others that legislators carry. So there's a hold on a discussion of those bills. But I think, again, it points to the need to have perhaps a broader piece of legislation, if that's required, or for the State Department of Education to act on their own, as they are capable of, within statute, of doing and developing their own curriculum.
I have a quick comment and then a question for Dan. We have a grandnephew that lives in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is a very liberal, progressive community, and he couldn't wait to tell us he's 5 years old that his teacher was a they and it was not a man or a woman, that the person was non-binary. This is a 5-year-old. And my question for you is, when you talk about curriculum, I'm not an educator. I see 2 different things. I see sensitivity, teaching, children that LGBT people, are the same as other people, and they just have different preferences, and talking about people like that were LGBT, like Walt Whitman. But then I see a whole other thing about the history and the legal part and rights. So when you talk about curriculum, are you talking about all of that?
It's a great question. I'm a firm believer. I think there's been a lot of educational work done around kind of tolerance, teaching tolerance. And I think that gets us to a certain distance in the conversation. But I actually think that real content maybe carries us even further. So, to talk about a transgender soldier from the Civil War as part of talking about the variety of people who participated in the war already assumes tolerance and takes students into a kind of richer discussion. So I actually think that social studies curriculum might surpass, I don't know, but what kind of tolerance curriculum does. And that's sort of, when I talk about curriculum, it's much more that, let's bring in the lives, the history, the events from the broad range of LGBTQ experiences, because I think that's actually very powerful.
Senator, talking about curriculums, did you know exactly what you wanted to be when you started going to school? Did you know that you was going to become a senator, as a conclusion, or was it like you just went with different curriculums until you figure it out?
No, it's a really good point because I think it's, education is meant to inspire, and I really believe my interest in public service, I can almost trace back to this history course I had on my home state, and it was not rich with diversity, as yours was not either. But hopefully it is now. I'm not sure if it is in West Virginia. I may have some doubts, but I think it goes to the issue of building a citizenry that is educated and able to govern and make decisions on behalf of our population, and in particular protect the most vulnerable. To have empathy for your neighbor, some of my colleagues lack that, and it's shocking to me. And it's why we need to have a fully funded Department of Education. And finally, this year in the state budget, we've achieved, after over 25 years of fighting in the trenches, the fully funded New York City school budget through the Campaign for Fiscal Equity that was promised to us decades ago. So there is progress, but there's a lot more work to do. Thank you for that question.
I think we're running low on time, but do we want to take the last two questions and then?
Hi, I wanted to ask, if you were the leader in designing the curriculum, is there a particular historical figure who you definitely would want to include?
It's funny that when we were having these meetings at the Department of Education a couple of years ago to start to map out this Hidden Voices curriculum, I mean, I'm the wrong person to ask because I was saying, why 20? I think I've got 50 names that we should be putting in the curriculum. So I don't think I have a good name. I have to say, one person who's been talked about a lot recently, who's in our curriculum, but I think is so compelling, is Pauli Murray, who was active in so many movements. Somebody had the analogy, that Pauli Murray is like the Forrest Gump of American minority rights movements, active in the Black Civil Rights Movement, active in the feminist movement, influential in a variety of key legal decisions, and born a woman and really struggled with her gender identity, a really interesting life story. And I think there's a documentary about her right now that's been screened here, right? So I don't know that I'd hang my hat on one person, but I think Pauli Murray is really compelling.
And I would say, and again, I don't think politicians have any right to drop a curriculum, but I would point out the fact that it can't be static because we learn more about historical figures. For example, in the New York City Council, the movement, which I think is a just one, to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson. And Walt Whitman himself has, some dubious writings in the area of civil rights and liberty. So we have to be, I guess, nimble when it comes to understanding historical figures and not, put people on a pedestal and leave them there to collect dust, but continue to ask questions.
Good evening. I just want to make a little comment about people with disabilities who you never know who is LGBTQ. I've noticed that people with disabilities, like autism, has been attacked daily, but I never know the person with autism could be LGBTQ. You know what I mean? And I have a disability myself. I'm mild intellectual developmental disability.
I think it's a great point, and I think your point speaks to what academics like to talk about as intersectional identities, right? That none of us is one story. We all of us have many identities. And in a way, I think this goes back to the discussion we were having earlier about having a curriculum that kind of opens a space for us to kind of reflect America's diversity. And to reflect the fact that people live inside of many silos. I think Pauli Murray is a great example of that as well, right? Someone whose life cross-cut a variety of identities and found a way to participate in a variety of movements. So I think that's a great point, and I think to me it circles back to this idea that we can introduce these different qualities and talk about the different qualities that historical figures have because they exist, or they have so many different identities that it allows us to make a rich curriculum around, in some ways, people that we're already talking about.
And I would say back to the issue of resources and how they're allocated, we haven't done a good job in New York City or across the state in identifying those students who do have developmental intellectual disabilities. For example, around dyslexia, 15 to 20% of our New York City public school students are probably dyslexic. None of them are screened for it at any juncture in their education. I'm glad that incoming Mayor Adams wants to change that, but I think if we started to spend more money identifying and screening young people who have these disabilities, I think there'd be greater understanding and recognition that we need to teach about their lives as well.
Well, on that note, I guess I would like to thank everyone for attending this event. Thank you so much to our panelists for our first event for the LGBTQ Policy Center, to Harold Holzer, and then the event staff, Mac Barrett and Magda, who've just done a wonderful job making sure that this event came together. And then, of course, to all the audience members. And we're trying to put another event together on the struggle to end or repeal the Walking While Trans legislation that succeeded in February of last year, that will hopefully be in place on December 8th. So please keep your eyes out for an email about that event as well, which should be really exciting. All right, thank you all.